just how realistic do we see this timeframe as securing an agreement, both obviously with the EU in terms of potentially seeking amendments to the existing agreement, but also within Parliament?
I mean, the October 31st deadline was not one that was chosen by the UK. Whilst it was agreed to by and accepted by the Prime Minister, it was inherently an EU deadline. We had exceeded that March 29th deadline. We'd exceeded the one in April, and they had to choose a date to which they could extend this negotiating period. Probably they chose the one date that was probably the most difficult to actually successfully negotiate a conclusion. It was neither long enough for real political change in the UK and for that real political change then to result in a changed negotiating position perhaps, and a successful renegotiation, nor was it short enough for the pressure on UK politicians to be maintained at a very high level. And maybe some cynics would suggest that was exactly why the date was chosen. It was neither one thing nor the other. The consequence, however, is that with a new Prime Minister taking office on July 23rd, there are, I think, 99 days between then and the scheduled departure day to deliver something different. And that is going to be a real challenge, whatever the rhetoric of the leadership election, and in many ways the speeches and the answers that have been given during the leadership election to the Conservative Party membership, it has almost been a little bit of a parallel universe. We're now going to move on July 23rd into the harsh reality of, whatever we said for the last 2 months. Now the reality is, how are we actually going to do things between now and departure day? And I think that's going to be a really, really tall order to get that agreement, an agreement in place, or indeed to get a departure through the House of Commons, which is without a deal, which is not something the House of Commons wants to happen.
I think just to add to that as well, ultimately what you've got here is a situation where Boris Johnson has really effectively said different things to different people. And it leaves you with the assumption that by Halloween, one group of people is going to be pretty disappointed because he has effectively told the Remainers, and let's not forget, Boris Johnson has quite a lot of Remain backing in this campaign. A lot of Remainers are backing Boris Johnson because they think he's going to be the liberal, global London mayor type of Boris Johnson that we had in the last decade. But he has effectively said to those people, don't worry, I'm not going to leave without a deal. There's no problem here. We're definitely going to get a deal. But he said to all of the ERG, which is the European Research Group of Tory MPs, a faction of the Tory MPs who advocate a no-deal Brexit, he said to them, I have no problem leaving with no deal. So, one of those groups of people is really quite likely to be disappointed by Halloween, and that's going to give him a very, very early problem in his premiership, and it will probably come along at that point as well with a vote of no confidence tabled by Jeremy Corbyn, tabled in the government. Those two things at the same time could actually be pretty explosive at that point. I think the other thing just to remember here as well is that Boris Johnson thinks that the deal that he wants has really already been offered. So you'll have heard this line probably a few times by members of the ERG, the European Research Group, who said, actually, what we want is a Canada-style free trade agreement. And the EU offered us this a couple of years ago, and we said no because we wanted to negotiate some sort of bespoke alignment agreement, which became what May negotiated. So they think this is relatively straightforward, and that we go back to Europe and say, we actually want what you offered us a couple of years ago. We just want an FTA like Canada's got. Let's put it in place. We'll get it worked out pretty quickly, and everything will be fine. Now, you can make your own decisions as to how realistic that is. I think even if the EU said on day one, sure, we'll give you that deal, there is still a significant amount of time has to go into ironing out exactly what it looks like. And 99 days is probably not enough.
Yeah, I think.
And Gareth, you might have a view, Gareth, on the backstop implications for all of that as well, of course, because that's the other thing. When you look at the different options here, no deal, alignment according to the May deal, a free trade agreement. All of these things have different implications for the Northern Irish border. And that ultimately, remember here that they need the DUP to vote with them or nothing goes through. That ultimately will have a very significant impact on the success or failure of any deal.
Yeah, there's a couple of very important things to mention here. Obviously, you can't move on to discussions about Canada plus 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 or Norway or anything like that until the UK has actually left the European Union. And that has been one of the fundamental flaws within, in terms of how the UK has approached the negotiations by allowing the EU to separate out the negotiation in that way, i.e. between withdrawal and future relationship. And that is really what has caused the issues with water. I have to say I'm somewhat pessimistic about the UK's ability to make significant improvements on the backstop, the Northern Ireland Protocol arrangements. And for two fundamental reasons. The first is a higher existential question about the EU itself. And with Merkel leaving the stage, he would be widely seen as the more pragmatic of the two between herself and Macron. Macron very much sees the future of the EU as a rise in populism across the rest of Europe. So the French view about making adjustments on the Irish border is one about diluting the principles of the European Union as a whole, the four pillars, and the concern is that when you tug at that thread, where does it end? The second one is a fundamental misunderstanding about what's happening in Ireland, the Irish the domestic politics in Ireland. And Leo Varadkar is under a lot of pressure in Ireland across a whole range of domestic policy issues. But the one issue where he polls really, really well, along with the Taoiseach Simon Coveney, is on their approach to Brexit. And Ireland in the last few years has found a renewed sense of optimism. It's been on a pathway of social and liberal change. Its economy, it emerged from the crash very well. Its economy is the second fastest growing in the EU. The Irish public opinion is such that they want to see the Irish government maintain a strong position in terms of Brexit. And there is a sense in Ireland that they would find a way through if the UK had to leave without no deal. So I think this notion that the parties will finally stump up towards the end of the negotiation where no deal might become a reality is to ignore the Irish domestic political situation.
I think, Simon, just to chip it, I mean, I think there is one thing that could change things quite radically, but I think we would all have different perspectives on how likely it is, and that is if the EU was to say that the backstop arrangement was not an infinite one, and that actually it had a finite arrangement, so it would last for 5 years or even 7 years. Then I think that would be enough to get a negotiated exit through the House of Commons. The question, of course, is, would the EU accept it? Would the EU accept a renegotiation on that basis? And I think the only way in which you could foresee a situation where the EU just might is if we move towards the end of October and no deal becomes clearly the obvious outcome, is the only way this is going to unfold. And if the question then is, does Ireland and the EU want to have a no-deal border situation in Ireland on the 31st of October, or does it want to have a deal with a backstop and a time limit where that no-deal situation happens not on the 31st of October, but happens potentially 7 years down the line? Then I think that might become in extremis, and when it actually comes to that key negotiating moment, might become a more attractive prospect to the EU than it has been hitherto. And I think that's the only basis on which I could foresee a renegotiated deal within those 99 days that then gets the approval just of the House of Commons.
where I think Peter's on to something in the direction of travel that I think the Irish government might go in is they may get to the point where they accept some form of time limit on a backstop only under the conditions that there is the provision to extend it in certain sets of conditions or scenarios. And at that point, you would effectively have the backstop as it is now. It continues on an ongoing basis, but it just operates in a slightly different way. Those are the only conditions where I could see the Irish government moving on that.
Thanks, Gareth. It's interesting. Obviously, we've seen weakness in sterling. Markets are worried that the spectre of a potential no-deal crash-out scenario is back on the table in perhaps a way that it hasn't really been considered for some time. But with everything that you're saying, and despite Boris very much presenting himself as a black and white candidate, it's possible then to draw a conclusion that the most likely outcome is perhaps just a repackaged, slightly amended version of the existing withdrawal agreement, but obviously just packaged up in a way that keeps others as happy potentially.
Andy, you crack on.
Yeah, I think that I think we have to separate rhetoric from reality here. And the truth is that a lot of the no-deal terminology that's going around just now, mainly led by Boris Johnson, is a negotiating tactic, which is a questionable negotiating tactic because they're basically saying, believe us when we say we mean we'll leave without a deal. And I don't think anybody in the EU really does believe that. But it's also a way to get votes in the leadership election and get support from fellow MPs. It remains the case that although it is by no means impossible, obviously, given everything that's going on, it remains relatively unlikely that there will be a no-deal scenario. And there are two main reasons for that. One is that Boris Johnson doesn't want to leave without a deal. I think we have to remember back to 2 or 3 years ago, this was a man who actually found it very difficult to decide which way to vote in the referendum and which way to campaign. He wrote 2 leader articles for the Daily Telegraph, both designed as his coming out of which way he was going to campaign. One was a Remain article and one was a Leave article. So this is somebody who was in 2 minds about it in the first place. He is not an ERG-style no-deal person. He's not that person. So he doesn't want to leave without a deal. That's reason number 1 why it's not likely. And reason number 2 why it's not likely is maths. It has been made pretty clear that all parliamentary procedures will be used in order to prevent no deal. John Bercow, the Speaker, has said he will allow facilities in Parliament to be used to ensure no deal can be voted on. And if it comes to a vote, it is almost impossible to see a situation where no deal actually goes through. There are at least 30 Tory MPs who have formed a group saying they will oppose no deal. And that in itself is enough, even if they get all the other votes, including the DUP. That group of 30 Tory MPs opposing no deal is enough to make sure it can't happen. So for those 2 primary reasons, no deal is an unlikely outcome. It is not impossible, but it is unlikely. And a third reason to add to that is that for all the rhetoric on the European side, they also do not want a no-deal outcome. The European Union wants a deal. So no deal remains unlikely, and it would be an accident. No deal would be an accidental outcome.
I think there's two interesting potential outcomes here to float, Simon, at this point. And in a scenario where Prime Minister Johnson is frustrated from pursuing his negotiating tactic, which is to prepare and ramp up the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, to then change the negotiating terms to create the opportunity for something to be done. If he is frustrated by the current House of Commons in that tactic, there are, of course, there's one big option for him. That is, he could seek to change the makeup of the current House of Commons by calling a general election. And that I think is something which holds significant risks for the Conservative Party. But Boris Johnson is nothing if not willing to accept risks if there is a potentially good outcome from it. So I think potentially he might say, do you know what? I think I'll take this case to the country and I'll win it, and I'll win the backing of the people that gives me a different kind of House of Commons that allows me then to re-embark on my negotiating strategy. And I think the alternative, though, and he will look for alternatives, because in the current political environment, as the European elections and local elections showed, there are some outcomes that are absolutely catastrophic for the Conservative Party in that if he embarks upon that general election strategy. There's an alternative in my mind that I just wonder about, which is Boris Johnson, which he is, such a self-confident person that the argument for a second referendum hitherto has been one that has been put forward by those who want to stop Brexit. I just wonder whether there may come a point in the autumn where the prospect of a second referendum starts to move away from those who want to stop Brexit to those who actually want to force it through. And might Boris Johnson say, I don't want a general election because people don't want that, but I'll tell you, we're going to have a second referendum and I will campaign to absolutely tell them again and take us out. And I wonder whether Boris Johnson might just have the mentality that might just embark upon such a risky strategy. For risks there would be, but it might shake up the box. And as Andy has said, in a situation where the House of Commons is potentially frustrating his main ambition, he might just need to shake up the box.
I think that's a really interesting point, Peter. And obviously a development we haven't touched upon thus far that's emerged this week is the so-called settled policy when it comes to Brexit within the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn's about turn. Just touching upon some of the points you've raised there, how do you think that could potentially impact upon developments, the political scenario in the UK, in the event that, as you say, Boris Johnson decides to consider going down that road?
Well, I mean, Labour are, as they say, Labour are on a journey as far as Brexit is concerned. Gareth, you might want to come in after I've said a few words. There's a progression here, and in my mind, it inevitably ends with Labour being active proponents of a Remain stance. It holds massive risks for the Labour Party, not least of all, it's happening at a time where through anti-Semitism allegations and all sorts of other things in the background, the party is weak structurally, in that the leader's office is separated from the rest of the party. But they're going to have to make a decision on Brexit, and it looks to me that all the tea leaves are reading towards them moving to a Remain stance, as major risks for their seats that they hold in the north of England. But it looks to be that that's their strategy. Gareth?
I agree with that. I must say a core part of the Labour strategy to be successful in any general election would be to win in Scotland and do very well in Scotland. And just given the state of the party north of the border, and given the Labour leadership's other political challenges, we have to remember if any of the other prospective leaders of the Labour Party had won back when Corbyn became leader, it's just inconceivable that the main opposition party is not 20 points ahead of this current government. I'm just not sure there are advantages to Labour in going down the general election strategy at the moment.
Yeah. It's certainly. I mean, they're going to have to make a call, and it's such a. I mean, the reason why Jeremy Corbyn has avoided making this fundamental decision for so long is he has sought to maintain two sides of the party: one very working class, very northern, quite Brexit, and one increasingly metropolitan, increasingly middle class in university towns and in London and the south. He's having to make the call. It's beyond the scope of our call this morning, but one of the longer term potential outcomes of the way that politics is emerging in the UK is that, curiously, the Conservatives become the party of the working class, the CQDs and so on, who are much more Brexity, much more in favour of the working class agenda, if you like. And Labour becomes quite metropolitan in its style, because certainly that's the consequence of some of the migration. And I certainly know a lot of Conservative strategists are quite concerned at the way in which, if that unfolds, they don't quite have the people nor the mechanism for retaining that kind of support base in the long term.
I spoke to a fairly senior Liberal Democrat politician last week, and the question that they posed, and it's very difficult to answer, is to what extent have Remain voters in the UK given up on the Labour Party? Because that's largely untested in the context of a general election, which is a very different prospect than a European Parliament election. But Labour could have a very serious problem if in the minds of Remain voters, they've simply decided that they now should be Liberal Democrats on the basis that the Liberal Democrats have, like it or loathe it, maintained a very consistent position on Brexit from the start. Polling can't really tell you the extent to which voters have made up their mind in that context, but again, in terms of the electoral mathematics, that would pose a very serious problem for Labour in many of its key areas.
Excellent. I think some absolutely fascinating insights there, and I'm conscious of time, obviously, for our viewers. I think we could discuss this for the rest of the day. There's obviously so many developments taking place and so many potential outcomes. But I think just to take everything that's been raised and to take it into an investment context, we've obviously seen quite profound change, and we've seen quite profound uncertainty within the UK, both from a political perspective, but that is now coming through from an economic perspective as well. Despite this, and obviously a lot of investors will be very aware, markets have very much been in fine fettle year to date, and indeed off the back of what was a very challenging fourth quarter of 2018, we've seen some exceptional gains despite this political backdrop and uncertainty that I think it's important to emphasize doesn't stop solely at these shores. We obviously have the ongoing developments around the US and Chinese tariff negotiations, but we also have an increasingly supportive, dovish rhetoric coming through from central banks, which has done a lot to calm nerves and has done a lot really to put markets in an upward trajectory thus far in 2019. Just to echo some of the comments that my colleague David Miller made in the previous webinar that we held on this subject, yes, we are very much keeping an eye on what is taking place from a political perspective, making changes, being tactical and being active in our approach where we feel it's appropriate. At the same time, we are doing our level best to try and keep that bigger picture in mind. Investment obviously is not focused solely on the UK economy or indeed the UK stock market. And for our clients, we're trying to ensure that they remain diversified, not just from a geographic perspective, but also in terms of asset class exposure and underlying companies as well. So we're continuing to monitor all of these developments very closely and making changes where appropriate, but trying to think forward, trying to look forward at the opportunities that remain. I think that's all that's left for me to do now is to thank our panelists for their fascinating insights and for their time today. And also to thank you, the viewers, for your time and for dialing in. Just as a reminder, our website is packed full of our latest investment outlooks, our thoughts, our commentaries. For those that need a break from all of the political developments, there's some interesting reads there on wine, photography and gardening as well. But if you do have any questions off the back of today's updates, then as always, please do not hesitate to contact your usual Quilter Cheviot representative. But thank you once again for joining us, wishing you a very good weekend, and we look forward to picking these discussions up in the near future. Thank you.